So we want to just add the jump mechanic. Let's think how programmers think. First, when we want to press on the space bar, we want to add force upwards or add speed upwards so that the player propels themselves upwards. But we don't want to do that all the time, whenever the player is on the ground, only when the player is on the ground. So this is actually pretty easy to implement in code. We just need a couple of lines of code and it'll work. We need a couple of variables. We need a public float jump force. So you can actually type in public or private that it can be edited in other scripts. So if you have another class, another script, you can edit the jump force variable. But we're actually typing here public so it can show in the Unity editor and we can actually edit it whenever we want. And we want to add a public layer mask. What is ground? So what is a layer mask? A layer mask just basically differentiates between game objects basically. So right now if we go back to Unity just to show you something, we have right here over every game object we have this two things. We have a tag and a layer. So basically what these two things are, they're basically made by Unity so that the Unity game engine differentiates between two or more game objects. So if we have the player right here and we set a new layer, so for example, we can call this player. Oops, we can call this player, and we can call this ground. And now we can go to the player and add the player layer. That actually rhymes. And we can add the ground layer to the ground. So now the Unity game engine actually knows that this layer is a player layer. So whenever you have an if statement checking to see if you've collided with the player or something is happening to the player, you can actually use a layer. So layers are actually pretty handy ways to differentiate between game objects. Let's create a public float jump radius, and I'm going to create a public, or not a public, sorry, just a private bool called is grounded to check to see if we're grounded or not. So first of all, what we want to do is if we are grounded, if is grounded, what we want to do is we want to jump. How can we jump? So basically the same way we did movement, normal movement. We're just gonna call in rb.velocity equals new, or sorry, not new vector2, just type in vector2 dot up times jump force. So what vector2.up basically means is that it's basically the same as you type new vector, or sorry, basically the same if you type new vector2 and open in 0 on the x and 1 on the y. Basically the same exact thing, but vector2.up is way easier and way faster to type in, so I'm going to just type in vector2.up times jump force. So the force that we're going to add. That is if he's grounded, and input dot get key down key code dot space. So if we're grounded and we press on space, we want to go up. But when are we grounded and when we're not, and when are we not grounded? So we haven't actually set that yet. So what we can do is we can create a is grounded. You can type in is grounded equals physics 2D dot overlap circle, and let's create a new transform variable. So public transform ground check pause. So basically it's the position to check if we're grounded or not. We're just gonna put this at the player's feet. It's basically just the position. So ground check pause dot position. It's a transform class. So right here, this little component right here is a transform class or transform component. Classes and components in Unity are basically the same thing. So in Unity there are built-in classes like a box collider or a rigid body collider, and you can actually make in classes which are scripts, which are components. So yeah, everything you can add, any component is a class basically. That's what I'm trying to say. And right here is a transform class. In the transform class, we want the position. So the position of what? The position of the ground check pause. So we haven't actually set what the ground check pause is. Well, we're gonna set it in the editor. A radius. So jump radius, and we want to differentiate it. So we want to make it. We want to tell the Unity game engine to just check for this layer or this object. What is ground? So if we're colliding, what this line of code means is if we're colliding on the ground check position, if the ground check position is colliding with whatever is ground, so we're gonna set that, so the ground variable, so the ground layer. So if we're colliding with the ground on the ground check position, and the jump radius is actually the radius, then is grounded equals true. And when is grounded equals true, that means that we are grounded. And when we are grounded and we press on space, we can actually jump upwards. We can actually add force in the y-axis, and you can jump upwards. So now if we save it, I'm going to go back to the Unity editor. Now if I go to the player, what it's going to want from me to specify is a couple of things. One of them is the jump force. So I'm going to set this to something like 10. And I'm going to set what is ground. So I'm going to go to the square. I'm going to set add layer, and I'm going to type in ground. So I've already typed in ground here, so there's no need. I'm going to go back here, and I'm going to set it to ground. Now just make sure to actually go back to the game object and set the layer to ground, because when it's just type in add layer, it's not going to add. So what is ground? Set it to ground. And the jump radius, I'm going to set this to 0.25. And the ground check position, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to create a empty game object. The empty game object already has the transform components like any game object does. I'm going to call this ground check pause. I'm going to go back to player. I'm going to set the ground check pause at the exact feet of the player. So right about here. Or here. So what it's gonna do is it's gonna create a circle in this area. So right now it just created a circle, and its radius is 0.25. You can actually, what we can do, we're gonna go back and we're gonna create an on draw gizmos. You know what? On draw gizmos selected. On draw gizmos selected. And it basically just draws gizmos. So you can call in gizmos, or what was it called? Draw sphere actually. Gizmos dot draw sphere, and we want it to be in the ground check position dot position. I want it to be the jump radius. So now if we save it, we go back. All right, so if we select the player, it shows us this gizmo right here. And gizmos are basically a really nice way to show anything. If we want to draw a line, it'll just show in the editor, in the scene view. It's not going to show in the game, don't worry. So we can basically edit the radius, and if we set it to 2, it'll select this radius. I'm going to talk about it again, but what we actually did is we created right here, what we did is we actually created a overlap circle, a circle. What we did, in what position? It took from us 3 values. This physics2d.overlap circle, this is a function, and what it took from us was 3 parameters. One was the position of the circle, so we set that. It wanted a vector 3 or vector 2 value, so we set it as ground check pause dot position. In the jump radius, it wants a radius, so we set the jump radius as its radius, and the layer mask, so to differentiate between what is grounded and what is not ground. So to differentiate between what is ground and what is not ground. And we actually set that in the editor. So now if we go back and we set what is ground, and we set the jump radius to 0.2, this is actually different from the player scale. So maybe if you have the player scale actually smaller, you can set the jump radius to something smaller, or if you have the player scale a bit bigger, you can set the jump radius a bit bigger. But mine basically works good at 0.2, so there's no need. Now if we press on play, and if I go right, if I go left, and if I jump, he jumps, the player jumps. But the jump is a bit too floaty for my taste. So what I'm actually gonna do is I'm gonna set this here. I just like the player controller to be at the bottom of everything else. I'm gonna set the gravity scale to something like 3. I'm gonna play around with the jump force a bit, maybe keep it at 13. I'm gonna play and see if I like the settings. Now if I go right or if I go left and I can jump 15, yeah, 15 is pretty good. And just remember to set it again as 15, and nice.